Hello, folks, and welcome back to World War II TV. And because of the time of day, I think we truly have a global audience. We normally have a fairly global audience, but I know we've got people in the USA and people in England and people in Australia watching this, and of course, other places around the world. So this is our first show in our Disasters and Tragedies week. And before I introduce my guest, I want to talk a little bit about perceptions and how battles are perceived by perhaps the general public and maybe the military historians and the well-read people, because I got a bit of pushback on Twitter for putting this show in Disasters and Tragedies week. And why didn't I put it in the Pacific week? Well, it could have easily fallen into either of those headings. The reason I put it this week was because I thought it fitted, and we discussed with my guest about where to fit it in. But perceptions are important, because I think about battles like Dunkirk, in that maybe the average member of the public who's aware of Dunkirk thinks of it as this massive great rescue of tens of thousands of British and French and other troops from the beaches of Dunkirk. And they perhaps forget that thousands were left behind, some of whom were killed, some of whom were captured, some of whom were murdered by the SS. We talked about the sinking of the Bismarck a couple of weeks ago, which somehow we've managed to think of this massive great defeat and destruction and loss of a German capital ship by sort of forgetting HMS Hood. We haven't forgotten HMS Hood, but we've seen it as a victory and kind of moved that HMS Hood story to one way. And the same thing I think applies to the New Guinea campaign, 1942, which we're talking about today, in that people who understand the timeline, understand what's going on, might think of the New Guinea campaign in one way, but perhaps the average member of the public, when you say Kokoda, it kind of resonates in that same way that somewhere like Gallipoli does, or some of the battles in 1916 in First World War. So we're going to talk about perceptions and how the public understand and process battles. But that's me. That's my ramble done at the beginning of the show. I'm going to introduce my guest. I've been really excited to have someone from Australia on again, because I do like the point of view that comes across from that part of the world. So my guest today, Dr. Karl James, who is the head of military history at Canberra in the Australian War Memorial, an author, lecturer, teacher. So hello, welcome to the show, Karl.
G'day, Paul. How's it going?
I'm very well. I'm a bit nervous about the football tonight, if I'm being really honest. I woke up with butterflies in my stomach, but we won't talk about the Euros right yet. But we just talked a little bit before going online, and you're defending your choice of putting this in the Disasters Week and or Disasters and Tragedies Week, and we'll discuss that later on. But you're part of a team that is presenting World War II to people who go to museums. You're presenting kind of a national version of things. Has the Australia's understanding and perception of Kokoda changed over the years, do you think?
Oh, thanks, Paul. And thanks for putting Disasters and Kokoda back on me.
Well, I thought I'd just drop it into you.
But no, I do think it does work quite well, because again, if you take our minds back to 1942, particularly those first 6 months of that disastrous year, from the Australian perspective, you have the fall of Rabaul, Singapore falls, Darwin, Ambon, Timor, Darwin's attacked for the first time. We have Japanese midget attacks in Sydney Harbour on 31st of May, 1st of June 1942. So, that first 6 months was incredibly disastrous. The world and the war had changed from Australia. Previously, we'd have forces deployed overseas, in North Africa, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and then all of a sudden the war is now in our own backyard. So, yeah, it's a huge disaster. And then when we're thinking about Kokoda, one of the reasons I think Kokoda resonates is because it is the story of underdog. Initially, from the Australian perspective, it is one of defeat. You have a small group of relatively young, somewhat inexperienced soldiers fighting across the Owen Stanley Range, this formidable terrain, the mud, the rain, the conditions, it's pretty hard. The press reports coming back to Australia, again, they seem to be disastrous. And from General Douglas MacArthur's point of view, who's the Commander-in-Chief of the Southwest Pacific area, when he's in Brisbane and then later on when briefly visits Port Moresby, it's certainly a disastrous campaign, because we're on the back foot, because we're losing essentially. And yeah, it changes, it does pick up. So I think in many ways it does make sense to put Papua into that disaster category, but it does have the good shot. We do win at the end of the campaign. And then going back to your first question too about has Kokoda changed? Yeah, it has, totally. And it's really interesting, because we tend to think about Kokoda now. It is one of the high points of Australia's experiences in the Second World War. So you have the names of Tobruk, Changi, Kokoda, Sindakin as well. So it is one of those sort of high points of the war, but it wasn't always the case. Immediately after the end of the Second World War, Kokoda was just like one of many campaigns. And for about 30 or 40 years, Kokoda was just one of, it kind of disappeared into a green hole in the same way that all the campaigns in New Guinea from 43 through to 45 have. And it's only really in the early 1990s that Kokoda really came back to the fore. Before then, Tobruk was the big story. That was the big go-to from Australia's Second World War experience. Tobruk balanced off Gallipoli, but that changed in the early 1990s. You had a rise of Australian sort of nationalism. You had Prime Minister Paul Keating talking up Kokoda, talking up the Pacific. Prime Minister Keating was promoting a very strong Australian story, and you can't get a much stronger. Kokoda is an incredibly strong Australian story for reasons we'll probably talk to later during the conversation. So that worked. People were trekking the Kokoda Trail for the first time, so it became accessible. And I think, you know, and you've seen this with your battlefield work, if people can go to these places, if they can read the books but actually see the battleground for themselves, it does change people's perceptions. So it's really has changed and evolved. During the war and after the Second World War, Kokoda was just one of many, but from the 1990s, it's really taken off. And it's really going to be interesting to see what happens in the next few years as the last of that Second World War generation pass, where this space is going to go. So it's a really interesting time, I think, to be a historian or to be a historical communicator.
I mean, that is the big debate about how we move on from the veterans generation. It comes up in Normandy, it comes up in Arnhem, it comes, you know, all over the world. And you know, my other half, Mag, who's away today, she's desperately getting excited about a trip to the Market Garden battlefields in September with 10 World War II veterans, because how many more opportunities will there be to be with 10 World War II veterans? And so that is going to be an interesting phase. But on this underdog, I want to bring out the underdog idea as well, because I think in some ways, I don't want to be the Pom having a go at the Aussie, but you kind of like the underdog role to some extent. And the Kokoda story is part of it is connected because you do have quite a large military, but they are out in North Africa. At this point of the war, you're elsewhere fighting. You were quick to join in, quick to send your troops overseas, but that almost doesn't play with the underdog idea. The Chocos going into New Guinea is you have an army, just they're somewhere else, and so that's interesting as well. And I think travel very important. That you know, you go onto YouTube now and search for Kokoda, and all sorts of people have been there and travel logs and blogs and things, and that, of course, wasn't possible 20 years ago. And if it was possible, sharing the imagery with other people wasn't possible. So that's the thing, you know, we always meet Aussies in Normandy who are doing the main three. So it's Gallipoli, Kokoda Track, and then they're coming to Normandy in Europe to do some of, you know, the Flyers and the Navy, and that's the kind of big thing. And the First World War sides, of course, so 4, I guess. But anyway, we'll move in. So you've prepared, as usual, incredible PowerPoint presentation. If people have got questions along the way, we can address them, or we can do a question and answer at the beginning. But I'm going to hand over to Dr. Karl James, and then sort of join in with comments as they come up. So over to you.
Cheers, thanks, Paul. So just to start off here, that title slide, you mentioned the poor Chocos, the ragged bloody heroes of the 39th Battalion. We have an image here. This is the group of soldiers from the 39th forming up at Minari. So they've been in action for 6 weeks, and they really bore the brunt of that initial Japanese contact in the Owen Stanley Range. Now, the reason we call it Australia's Thermopylae is because, well, this is a direct quote from Ralph Honor. Ralph Honor commanded the 39th Battalion. He took over command of the battalion during Isarava. He wrote a fantastic account of the action, and he's been very influential in how we think and reflect about the 39th Battalion. Another key thing too is that, unlike other parts of the campaign, we see the 39th on film. So I think if you're thinking about when, you know, what things are remembered, what is commemorated, if you've got the soundbite and if you have the stills and the film, that really helps. And that's a big reason why Kokoda is probably remembered better or commemorated better than, say, other actions, which is Milne Bay. So we'll talk to that in the second part a little bit later on. And then, yeah, so breaking the invincible, this is a quote, a reference really to Slim, because the Battle of Kokoda is important. It goes from 4 months from July through November 1942. And we have really big, meanwhile, in eastern Papua, the Japanese also lend their forces in Milne Bay. And this is a decisive action. It's an amphibious operation. The Japanese are defeated. And this is in that late part of August, early September 1942. So Kokoda and Milne Bay are taking place at the same time. But Milne Bay is the first decisive defeat of a Japanese amphibious landing force. And of course, after the war, Field Marshal Slim wrote, when he wrote his fantastic memoir of Command in Burma, talks about the significance of Milne Bay and how it broke the invincible, because until this point, the Japanese were seen to be invincible. So that's the sort of explaining the title this evening.
And just to add to the idea about the disasters and tragedies week, is that definitely at the end of this campaign, it's been a disaster for the Japanese. So because we call a week disasters and tragedies, the implication may be that those disasters befall the Allies, but they could also be disastrous for the enemy. So we'll stand by our choice to put it in this week.
Oh, totally. But I think, again, too, it's very useful. And like, we're really used to thinking about the Second World War. It's really pretty much dominated by the European theory of operations. You know, we think about the Mediterranean, think about D-Day. And there's a whole bunch of Wuzzies in D-Day as well, Paul. So don't forget about those.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Lots of them, yeah.
And in the Navy as well. Several thousand Australians take part in the D-Day operation. That's a side story.
Well, we've had Adam Lani on talking about that, and we'll have you back on about that to go in the future. Yeah, but it's the ground forces less so, but yeah, naval and air force contribution massively so. Yes.
No, it's a fantastic book, but I digress. But now let's think about, so again, disastrous week, and you can't get worse for the Allies in that late 1941, early 1942 period. And certainly from Australia, if you look at a map, you can see why it was so disastrous for us. Australia, before the Second World War, had a very small military. And just for people with international audiences, essentially the Australian Army is based very much on the British Army. So we have battalions, brigades, divisions, corps, same structure, same weapon systems, same ranks, same very similar training. So they're very much integrated. There's a very strong sense of interoperability between British Imperial forces as well as the Australians. And so that's when the war broke out in September 1939, we raised a force. We raised the Second Australian Imperial Force. So these men are all volunteers. They volunteer to serve anywhere in the world for the duration of the conflict. They received the first initial training. They went overseas, and they spent much of 1941 fighting in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, back in the Australian mainland, so the Army has gone overseas. We have this relatively small Navy. Our force is deployed with the Royal Navy, and our Air Force, again, was also tiny. We expand with personnel through the Empire Air Training Scheme, where we're really sending pilots, airmen, and the like to Britain, the Bombing Command, and other things. So for the first few years of the war, our war is focused on the European theatre of operations. That changes suddenly with Japan's entry into the Pacific War, or the expansion of the Asia-Pacific, if you follow Richard Frank's argument, because Japan had been at war in China since the late 1930s, and so this was just a continuation of their approach. Pearl Harbor, though, changes everything, and suddenly from Australia's point of view, we were alone, we're threatened, our trained forces are overseas, and you've got those first few months or first few weeks 1942. It's just one defeat after another. So for an Australian point of view, the first real blow is the fall of Rabaul. We had a force there, and the Japanese invade Rabaul in January of 1942. And then it's almost like this domino effect of Rabaul, Timor, the Dutch East Indies go under. The Philippines stagger on, but then they collapse. And so from the British Commonwealth point of view, yep, forces here, forces there, forces there, boom, taken out by the Japanese. So we're very, very much on the back foot. Singapore falls on the 15th of February, 1942, worst defeat in British military history. 2/3 of the Australian 8th Division go into the bag. The remaining elements of the 8th Division are captured on Timor, Ambon, and Rabaul earlier. Other elements are taken with the fall of Java. And so Singapore's disastrous. And then only 4 days later, Darwin is attacked for the first time. And Darwin and Northern Australia will be attacked 100 times during the first part of the war. So that is why it's disastrous. This is a country where we weren't ready for a war on our doorstep. And all of a sudden the war has come home. It's like smashing on us. Now, from the Japanese point of view, and certainly from an Australian point of view, an Australian perspective, if you lived in Canberra, Sydney or Melbourne during this time, yeah, you're going to fear the Japanese. I'm here in Canberra, slightly off the map, and during the war, there were air raid shelters were being dug in and around Parliament House. In Sydney and in Melbourne, you had sandbags on buildings, barbed wire entanglements were put along beaches. There was a real massive threat a fear of the Japanese. Because the Japanese, once they took Rabaul, that then became the major Japanese base in the Southwest Pacific area. So Rabaul is key from the Japanese perspective. Australians are feeling incredibly vulnerable. Yes, the AIF will come back, but that's going to take a few months. General Douglas MacArthur will arrive, and when he arrives, he is celebrated as the saviour of Australia. But that's still a little bit off. That's not until March and April 1942. So those first few months of 1942, 100% disastrous. From the Japanese perspective, what they want to do is not invade mainland Australia, but they want to cut us off and stop Australia becoming a base for an American invasion or an American counterattack. And that's why the Japanese end up focusing on Port Moresby, because they want to get Port Moresby to cut off Australia from Papua, and the rest of the world.
Yeah. And Port Moresby, of course, came up in the show with John McManus last week. It's, one of the biggest harbours in the region and strategically important for both sides. And it's just to remind us that we covered that last week.
Oh, there's a great sense, a great connection between what you spoke about last week and this, because they're really the same size, the same part of the same story. Different chapters, same story. And from Port Moresby, though, again, in that during 41, even early 1942, Port Moresby had been a relatively small backwater. There were a small number of forces there, so soldiers such as the 39th Battalion, the 53rd, the 49th and the like. But initially, those soldiers, when they're sent to Port Moresby, they're really being used as a garrison force, as labour. They're not really preparing, doing a lot of military training operations. Instead, they're working on wharves, building fortifications and the like, but they're not doing a lot of soldiering as such. That changes, though, after the fall of Rabaul. And so you can see Rabaul up in New Britain. That's a major Japanese perspective. And the Japanese want to take Port Moresby, and they also want to consolidate the Solomon Island chain. And so that's also why they will end up moving on Guadalcanal and Tulagi and the like, and will try to get Guadalcanal. Yeah, they really want to get Port Moresby. The Japanese intended to take Port Moresby with an amphibious operation, but that's checked during the Battle of Coral Sea. And that's the battle map we have on the presentation right now. So Coral Sea, it's unique because it's the first action where most of the fighting is taking place by carrier-borne aircraft from the Americans as well as the Japanese. It's really a little bit of a draw in terms of aircraft carriers damaged and lost, but it does put a hold to the Japanese plans for an amphibious landing to take Port Moresby. So that's why the Japanese think about a plan B, because they still want to get to Port Moresby, but they're thinking, hey, okay, well, we've heard about this place called the Kokoda Trail, a little bit, but they want to instead land on the northern side of Papua around Buna and the like, and then we'll send a small, relatively small force across the Owen Stanley Range just to see if they can have a go.
And there's a closer map you got there. So yeah, and it's in a sense, we should have done this show first and then John McManus afterwards, but hey, that's just not how it worked out. But you can go back and watch the John McManus show again after this to kind of connect the dots, I suppose, so to speak. And yeah, I'm glad you brought the Coral Sea in there because it's an important part of the story.
Oh, it's huge. And so later on, and certainly because it really sets it up, we wouldn't, if not for Coral Sea, there would be no Kokoda. And likewise, Guadalcanal is a key part of the Kokoda story as well, which I'll get to. I'm just saying an Easter egg to watch out for it.
Yeah.
So with Port Moresby itself, it's on the southern side of Papua. A lot of what the Australians were initially doing, they did do some. The country outside of the garrison of Port Moresby were pretty panicked, really, after the fall of Rabaul, because they knew this small little part of Australian territory, the backstop of the empire in many ways, limited defensive, small air force capability, which will increase during the course of 42, but in that June-July period is pretty minimal. The soldiers who were there, mainly the 30th Militia Brigade, so these were militiamen, so many of them had been called up, so they'd been conscripted for service, or they were either too young or too old for the AIF, that volunteer Australian Imperial Force. So they had a limited amount of training, very simple weapons really to pick from. And when they were in Port Moresby, what they were doing is either working as labourers or they were digging trenches, laying barbed wire. There was some military exercises and training outside of Port Moresby, but that country looks a lot like the Australian bush, like it's flat, it's rolling country, grasslands, lots of gum trees. It's not dense jungles. It's not mountainous. Hilly, but not mountainous. So even though those soldiers had been in Port Moresby for several months, they're not doing jungle training. So that's why Port Moresby was quite key. Now, the other way to get across Port Moresby, you have to do it either by foot or even to fly over. You have to cut across the Owen Stanley Range. The Owen Stanley Range is like this massive spine that runs down the length of runs down the length of Papua. It really divides that part into two. And then on the northern side, you have Boonaga and Sanananda. Kokoda Station is on the northern side of the Owen Stanley Range. It was a small government station at the time. And then from the other side, you got Owen's Corner, and that's really during the course of the campaign. That's where because you can take a road from Port Moresby, go past. If you take a road out to Owen's Corner, it takes us a couple of hours today. It took more hours back in 42, and so that's really how the terrain we're looking at from this map. And then if we flick over to the other one, we'll get a stronger sense of the Kokoda Trail itself. So this is outlines the Kokoda Trail. The Kokoda Trail, it's 96 kilometres long. Runs from Owen's Corner in the south across the Owen Stanley Range. You have places like Uberi, Intermated Ridge, Uriobaiwa, Nauru, Afogi, Myola 1, Myola 2. They were dry lakes. They became very important supply dumps during the campaign. Isarab and then Kokoda you crest the mountain, then you come down a little bit, and there's Kokoda Plateau. So that track that footpath is either the Kokoda Trail, the Kokoda Track, depends on your perspective as to what you want to call it.
And just while we got that subject there, does that really matter whether it's a track or a trail? I mean, it is one of the debates that has been raging for decades. Does it really matter?
No.
Yeah,
doesn't.
Let's move on. It's just semantics, isn't it? It's just labels, and some people called it this, and some people called it that, and it's just a label.
There's a lot of myth around it. So the trick was why it's such a cause of frustration, and this is where I'll get haters. So before the war, it was just one of many foot tracks across the Owen Stanley Range. Like there were hundreds of them across it, but it was unknown. Well, sorry, it was unused. So it was used a lot, but it wasn't named. It was sometimes referred to as an old mail trail because they're the government station to Kokoda. There's also mines on Yoda Valley, which is nearby, and they had a backwards and forwards track, backwards and forwards across the mountains. It was unnamed at the time. During the war, though, we start to see references to track, trail, and it's really to differentiate the main footpath to give it a name rather than sort of unnamed foot tracks. After the war, when the Battle Honours Nomenclature Committee sits, I think, we had this fantastic action. We need to call it something. So it became the Kokoda Trail. That's the formal battle honour. In the early 1970s, the government of Papua New Guinea formally gazetted that foot route as the Kokoda Trail. However, the pushback is that Australians like to think of themselves as being Australians. And so we use, track is the word of the Australian bush, whereas trail is an Americanism. And you have all these stories about how General Douglas MacArthur, when he's getting his media releases, saying, the Kokoda Trail, and, just talking up the Americans and trying to poo-poo the Australians, which did happen, but it's really unrelated to this. So anyway, that's why you have this very circular debate around the Kokoda Trail, Kokoda Track. I don't think it matters. I use Kokoda Trail as my personal preference because it's the battle honour. But that's just me. People use Kokoda Trail. It doesn't matter. I think it's important we talk about the campaign. We talk about the men and women who were involved, the consequences of that action. We think about the Australians, the Papuans, and the Japanese. They're the important things, not spend hours on track or trail.
And indeed, the context, exactly the context you're putting into us today, thankfully, with this, the Coral Sea and the Rabaul and all those things. That it's that just seeing it as a tough fight on a track or trail is a narrow view of it. It needs to be broadened out and put into the context of what was going on around it. And it is, the thing is, we're nationalistic in our approach to these battles. Americans write about Guadalcanal, Australians write about Kokoda, and it should be more universal. It should be Australian historians tackling both sides of it, American historians, as John McManus is referencing Australians in his books. But it's still a bit of a nationalistic approach to things, which hopefully will change. We were talking before going online, folks, about the revolution over the last year with the pandemic has been the interaction between historians and creators of historical content online, people I didn't know 2 years ago who I now know, and we're sharing information, we're cooperating, we're engaging. It's incredible. There are people watching this from the USA, from Great Britain, from Australia, New Zealand, and Europe, all engaging in a conversation at the same time. That's how we'll make history a more universally understood and appreciated subject, rather than kind of cherry picking our own country's favorite bits into narratives.
Oh, I 100% agree, Paul. 100%.
Yeah. So there we are. There's and these are your photos, and that's, you know, we like on World War II TV to not just bring people who can talk about these events, but actually have been there as well. So when we did Stillwell Road last week, Finley Kemba had spent 4 years traveling the Stillwell Road, so you got that expertise of someone who knows there. And of course, you know, you've been there, and it's important that we talk about somewhere that you've been, because as James Holland always says, you got to see these battlefields for yourself to really understand them.
Yeah, it's very key. The challenge of a lot of Australia's battlefields in Papua New Guinea is they're not as accessible as just going across the channel to, say, look at Normandy or even the Western Front. So you really have to invest a lot of time.
You mean there's no cafes and restaurants and tour buses?
Well, there's not a lot to choose from food-wise. It's all pretty basic, but it's all very delicious, and the people are incredibly friendly. And it's a big part of Australia. The connection between the wartime connection between Australia and PNG has been really quite huge, and it's a big part of our engagement, I think, in the Pacific. And really, people should get out and look more at these battles. But just in terms of the Kokoda Track versus Trail thing, so this side is from the Owers Corner perspective, pretty much at the start of the trek. It says Kokoda Trail at the top. On the reverse of that side, it actually says Kokoda Track. So even here, you got like an each way bet. But it's really quite useful. Oh yeah, look, it's me. And that's just to say I was there. Had a look at it. So I actually supposed to go for in 20. I've had 2 trips to Kokoda postponed because of COVID. We're going to do it in 2020 with a group of kids from Legacy, which is a charity looking at war children, basically, so the children, veterans of children. That was cancelled because of COVID, and then 2021 was going to do it again, so earlier this year, and they got panned. So I'm really looking forward to getting back there one day.
Yeah, well, there should be some kind of support group for tour guides and historians who've not been able to get to battlefields ever. I mean, I'm lucky; I live in one, so I can just almost walk out the door and I'm at a battlefield. But for many people, it's just they've had their right arm cut off, in a sense, by not being able to travel. But of course, compared to people losing their lives, it's not a big thing. And you know, we're being very inwardly thinking, no, I can't do my battlefield trip when there's greater problems. But yes, there are a lot of people out there very frustrated they can't go and get their intake of battlefields. But it'll all change, I think. Hopefully next year we better one.
Oh, totally. But at least in here, you'll get a sense of what the terrain and the mountains look like. So when we're talking about a narrow foot track, it's really some parts it's pretty much single file today, and that was the case during the war. So it was very much single file. This is at first climb. So where we were, Owers Corner, you go down, follow the creek, kind of go around a bend. Not around a bend, there's a big mountain range there. And then the first climb that a lot of soldiers came across is this place called the Golden Stairs, running up Imminter Ridge. The staircase, the Golden Stairs or the Golden Staircase, the exact location now is lost a little bit in time, but it is one of those iconic parts of the climb. And why a lot of soldiers at the time refer to it is because this is their first steep climb that they really hit. So you can see going up the mountain track, engineers during the course of the camp, the Australian engineers developed the track. They corduroyed the road where they could. They cut down poles, and kind of cut a track up into it. In theory, it was quite good. In reality, it was a bit dangerous because it was constantly wet. So you got the rain, river crossings, and also you have hundreds, if not thousands of men going up and down these tracks. So very quickly and very soon too, soldiers talk about, if you're the first bloke, yeah, no worries. But if you're number 100 or 200 or number 600, as the battalion got stretched as it was moving up along the Kokoda Trail, you're stepping in mud, you know, those corduroy tracks, the timber broke. It was already kind of dangerous. And guys, when they got to the top of that, they're already knackered. And then that's to the point when I look up and think, whew, that's the first climb. And it's not even it's pretty high, but there are a lot more higher steeps, more mountains to go through. And so the soldiers themselves who, you know, young, fit men, they're exhausted of the first part of after the first climb, and so this is just a taste of what was to come, because that's one of one of the reasons why Kokoda resonates. It's not just about fighting the Japanese, it's about the terrain, it's about the environment, and it's the hostility of the whole box and dice. It's just a very difficult place to
Well,
fight.
that's what John McManus said last week. Yeah, the casualties lost to just disease and infection and loss of morale, and that wasn't just in 42. That carried on all the way through to 45, as Sol David was saying about Okinawa. You know, that's the thing about the Normandy campaign or the Italian campaign, is that the climate isn't trying to kill you necessarily in the same way. The local environment isn't trying to actually kill you. Whereas out there, everything's trying to kill you. You've got two enemies. You've got a real physical enemy with weapons, and you've got the enemy of just the environment. And you know, that's it can never be underestimated, underappreciated, that aspect of the battle at all.
Oh, absolutely.
So yeah.
So
that great photo you sent, by the way, that really got an idea across to me. The idea of the terrain and the elevations and the solidness of the jungle there, just crazy stuff.
Well, it's really the terrain itself, and so from and also for a lot of the early part of the campaign too, it was really what that was the supply line. So with the soldiers going up, that's also the route to bring supplies, ammunition, reinforcements, you know, that type of thing, as well as pulling back the wounded. So and that's absolutely right too. They had a lot of time is really given by not so much the distance, but how long it would take to get from point A to point B. So the Japanese had landed at around Buna on the 21st of July 1942. Around a similar sort of time, the Australians decided to send a force up across the Owen Stanley Range. That first group was led by a company from the 39th Battalion. Now, they initially went up really travelling quite light. They didn't have any weapons with them, so there was just really the rifles, Lewis guns, so your First World War vintage machine guns, and that was pretty much about it. Some Thompsons maybe a little bit later on. Your Thompson submachine gun. So very lightly armed, very lightly equipped. The view would be that once they made their way, so Sam Templeton and his men, once they made their way across the Owen Stanley Range and got to Buna, by that time, a boat would have been gone around with the heavy weapons, so the Vickers machine guns, so 2 and 3 inch mortars. But while that was happening, this is when the Japanese land on the northern beaches around the 21st of July. Sam Templeton and co make their way across, and then you have the first contact around the 23rd of July 1942. And then from there on, the 39th Battalion starts a series of withdrawing actions coming back to the Kokoda. So the campaign really develops its own momentum, so swings during late July into early August, as more Australian forces are sent up. So the rest of the 39th Battalion, and then other elements from the 30th Brigade, and also from the Japanese perspective, more and more forces land. So they're landed by Major General Horry and the South Seas Force, which we'll get to in just a little bit. So the campaign, there's ebbs and flows to it, but it really starts from the fighty shooty part from the 23rd of July 1942, and then will continue as the Australians start to fall back, and they start places from Kokoda, Daniki, and then later on Isarava, where we meet Ralph Honor. It's also, and so while the 39th Battalion dug in at Isarava, so they've been there for about 6 weeks by this point, already fighting against the Japanese. When Honor took over, because their 1st Battalion commander of 39th, Owen, had been killed or died of wounds at Kokoda as the Australians were falling back. They dig in Isarava using, as Honor said, their steel helmets, their bayonets, their nails, dig in and fight a fortified defensive perimeter of Isarava. And so the fighting of Isarava goes for about a week or so. And here we're met by the first group of soldiers from the first AIF veterans, so from the 2nd 14th Battalion, from the 21st Brigade, because by this time you're now getting more of the AIF soldiers starting to come across the mountains. And so these men had already served in the Syrian campaign, and they really seem to be a tonic to the 39th Battalion, those ragged bloody heroes, as they dug into Isarava. And of course, the 2nd 14th Battalion is it's a very powerful story, and you see this really quite well from the 5 officers in the foreground of this photo, when of those 5, 4 of them would end up being killed in Papua, and the 5th one was wounded. And indeed, so you've got Harold Bissett. So he's on my left. He's a tall guy standing with a cigarette in his hand. He dies in the arms of his brother Stan Bissett. So the 2 brothers served together in 2nd 40th Battalion. Harold's up front, he's wounded, he's brought back. Stan, who's another officer, goes forward. Hears his brother's dying, he's mortally wounded, and Stan holds Harold in his arms, and Harold dies, and Stan goes on and continues and fights the campaign. So it's a really powerful photograph, this one, just when you're thinking about, 600 Australians were killed during the fighting of Kokoda. Well, there's 4 of them just right there, and the 5th one's wounded. So it's a pretty powerful. And also, too, these, you'll note, they're all junior officers. This is very much a campaign where it's a very personal fight between lower ranked soldiers, so your privates and corporals, sergeants are taking in, and your subalterns. It's a very small battle space, and it's a very intimate action where you've got small groups of men digging in or going out and fighting patrols, fighting other groups of men against the Japanese. So it's a pretty brutal war.
John McManus made that point, Karl, about MacArthur, in a sense, later on in the battle, misunderstanding how that battle could be fought, and was sort of talking about sending in regiments or divisions or half divisions, when in fact it's a platoon engagement because of the visibility. It's as you say, it's junior leadership, and how can you deploy a huge force along a track that you can only take one person on at a time? It absolutely comes down to the skills of lance corporals and corporals and sergeants and of course officers there, and that's the nature of that fighting there, which is why I think it's very difficult to convey on screen as well. I mean, we have that Kokoda film that I talked about on Twitter last, which is all right, isn't it? It's pretty good, but it deliberately focused on a small group of men, because how else can you depict a massive, great battle in that kind of environment? The camera wouldn't be able to show the details of all these different things happening on, because you would simply lose everything into the jungle. So I think the nature of the way it's looked at by film is because of the very nature of this battle there being small unit.
Yeah, and in many ways too, once you step off the track, you can't see anything. It's all scrub, it's the trees, it's the jungle, it's so dark. You very quickly lose perspective. So the fighting continues into late August, and then 29th of August, the Japanese have surrounded the Australians in Disarava. It's quite a dire situation. And at this point, Private Bruce Kingsbury. So Kingsbury, who we see in this photograph here, he was 24 years old. Before the war began, he'd been a real estate agent. War breaks out, joins the AAF, serves in the Middle East. And then in late August, when the situation is critical, he leads an attack at Disarava, stabilises the situation, helps protect the Australian defensive line. But in that key moment, he's then shot down by a Japanese sniper. It's always the Japanese sniper, but he's shot down anyway and he's killed in the fighting in Disarava. And later on, he will be awarded a Victoria Cross. And so he's the first Australian recipient to receive a Victoria Cross on Australian territory, because at that time, Papua was, it was an Australian territory. So it's a very key moment in the battle. And in many ways, it really sums up the spirit of the fighting and the tenacity of Kokoda, and specifically Disarava, but also the Kokoda campaign. And that was one of his temporary battlefields. So the 39th Battalion, after Disarava, they're relieved. You have more units from the 21st Brigade are fed into the action, even though they end up subsequently falling back. So you have the 2nd 14th Battalion, 2nd 16th, and later on the 2nd 27th Battalion. Now, the soldiers from the 39th Battalion, they're the people that everyone thinks about. And this is actually a still from Damien Pera's very famous wartime film, Kokoda Front Line. And what you see here is that you don't see the actual fighting itself. You don't see combat, but you see the conditions. And this is partly why Kokoda started to resonate in 42, and then later on why it's been picked up later. It's these young soldiers still smiling, but you can see they're struggling up the hill, knee deep through mud, and it's a very powerful visual image of what they're struggling up against. Likewise, we've got, where I have here, say, the survivors of the 2nd 22nd Battalion. That is because after Disarava, the 21st Brigade is still fighting back. You have a very nasty, vicious action at Brigade Hill, where the 21st Brigade headquarters and its battalions, but it's kind of in a line. The Japanese come across, they cut off and isolate the brigade headquarters, and the 2nd 27th is almost knocked off of the track. And so you survive from this very vicious action, and this is where there's a huge amount of hand-to-hand fighting, hand-to-hand combat, bayonet charges and the like. The survivors are scattered into the bush, into the jungle, and they have to then make their way, because they're knocked off the main track, make their own way back to Allied lines. So again, it's this during this darkest phase of the withdrawal of the Australian withdrawal, because really from August through to September, the Australian force is just hemorrhaging men, whether it be if they're killed in action, wounded, getting lost, sickness, dysentery, guys just disappearing into the bush. It's a pretty stark action. And so battalions that went into the line, more than 600, nearly 700 strong, by the time when the 21st Brigade are taken out, so you have a combined 2nd, 14th and 2nd, 16th battalions, should be 2, they're down to 1, and there's only about 200 blokes together. So it's very incredible fighting.
I think we were going to probably mention the Japanese forces anyway, but Dennis Burns, who's been joining in the conversation, he's travelled there. I think he might have even lived there. He's adding some really cool information to the sidebar there, and that there are some of the Japanese forces are absolute combat veterans in this stage, and not just combat veterans; they're terrain veterans as well, which makes a huge difference. As the guys who've come back from North Africa in the Australian forces, they may well be good at fighting in the sandy desert, but it's completely different terrain. We have the same thing in Normandy with units that have come from North Africa being a little bit slower to adapt to the type of fighting that Normandy gave. The Japanese had become by this stage pretty good at what they were doing at this jungle warfare and just sustaining a force in an environment that, as we said earlier, is trying to kill you. So the Japanese forces should not be underestimated here.
Oh, you can never underestimate the Japanese, and we'll talk to that when we get to General Horry when he comes up. But but even here too, what's key is maintaining that supply lines and communication. So you do get a sense of, again, with the terrain, it's such a narrow fighting front. Part of the reason you can't put a whole bunch of forces into the line is because there was a view that one brigade, so 3 infantry battalions, could be sustained along the brigade. Any more than that, you just couldn't bring up the foods and supplies, and too many men would destroy the track. In terms of just the foot being destroyed. Yeah. And so the big part.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this part because someone put a question earlier, and I can't scroll back to find it, about exactly what the orders were for Australian forces and how they were to interact with the locals. Because someone said were there orders that they could be shot if they try to not to fulfil their duties. So I'd like you to elaborate on that if you wouldn't mind, please.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So again, if you have that map of the Kokoda Trail, when we're talking about all those different places such as Daniki, Saraba, Naro, and the like, they're all villages. This is a very heavily populated part of Papua. The Orokaiva people, they live on the northern side of Papua, so from Boona up to Kokoda. And the Kuari people, their land, they're the owners of the land from, well, basically the crest of the Owen Stanley Range back down to Port Moresby. So they're the big language groups. And so you have people living along your Papuans are living along the track themselves. When the fighting's taking place, a lot of the women and children just went bush. So they just kind of obviously fled the fighting, as civilians do anywhere in any part of the world. From the Australian, very early on in the piece, when Sam Templeton and the first company from the 39th Battalion were making their way over the Owen Stanley Range, they meet Bert Kienzle. Bert Kienzle was an Australian, well, he worked for the Australians, born in Fiji, but he was in Myola, not Myola. Yoda Valley. He had a station in Yoda Valley, so he knew the Kokoda Trail like the back of his hand, and he was there initially employed to basically round up men, or Papua men, to work as carriers. And so the carriers is a key part of the Australian story when we're thinking about Kokoda, because you've got the men, and they were from mainly the southern part of the Owen Stanley Range, but also carriers came from Port Moresby and various other places that were administered by the Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit, or ANGAU, and they were essentially conscripted to enforced to work for the Australians and all the Allied war effort. You also had Papuan police boys, for want of a better expression, help guard the lines and the carriers. So they're really quite key, and it's thought there were about several thousand, I think it's about 1,200 or 1,600 Papuans worked for the Australians just to maintain those supply lines, bringing up food, evacuating the wounded. The Japanese also used a number of carriers they brought with them from Rabaul and rounded up people in the northern beaches and forced them to work as well. But their supply lines were nowhere near as developed as what the Australians were able to do. So they're really quite a key part of the story. And when we're thinking about Kokoda too, this notion or the imagery of the fuzzy wuzzy angels is often represented both in the wartime film, so in Damien Perez's film Kokoda Frontline, in the artwork we see here, in the sculpture and the photograph, and of course in Sapper Bird Bartos's very famous poem, The Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, where he talks about the fuzzy wuzzy angels with fuzzy wuzzy hair. And so you have this sense of, key part of the story, but it's not, they're doing it not just because, Aussies are great blokes. It's because there is this force of coercion, a colonial territory, sort of working and coercing them to work for the Australian or the Allied war effort. But it's also really important to remember too that Papuans, New Guineans, as well as Solomon Islanders, they're also active combatants in the war. So they're working as scouts, as guides. You have them employed in the Papuan and the New Guinea infantry battalions. And so they're very much there. They have their own agency. They're fighting their war on their own terms because this is their land at the end of the day. They're protecting their villages, their crops and their homes. So it's Australians connect with this notion of fuzzy wuzzy angels, but there's way more to the story than just that.
And just it's a potential rabbit hole to disappear down, but has there been more writing recently from those participants, or is like we were talking about recently, how more and more history is coming out of India and Nepal and the Gurkhas? Are they starting to write their own history now, the Papua New Guineans?
Yeah, unfortunately, not as much as is really needed. So a lot of those records and documents from the Australian perspective, so the archival material, do refer to Papuans and New Guineans, but often with very little, like a surname, a village, but not a lot of information. And they talk about numbers, but not necessarily a lot of details or personal experiences. Now, in the late post-independence in PNG, so the late 1970s, early 1980s, there was a fair bit of oral history that took place within Papua and New Guinea to recall these memories and to capture their stories. And then really from the 2000s onwards, there has been some oral histories that were taking place. So Deakin University in Australia, they've got a Angels of War, which is an oral history collection where people went back and tried to capture their memories. But unfortunately, I think that oral history program is really too late. A lot of the life expectancy in Papua New Guinea isn't particularly fantastic, so the number of the veterans were very small. And what you tend to get now is that community shared memory, lived experience of like my father-in-law did this or that type of thing. So it's a really important part of how we understand the Pacific War. And it's unfortunate that not more work was done at the time. But I'm always
unfortunate, but not unsurprising. Unfortunately, given how we were back then as colonials and accepting our part as a Brit of our empire background, it's not surprising at all. We didn't record enough of the other participants, and it's come up so often how books I read as a kid about the Burma campaign didn't seem to mention any brown people, for example. It was always just about guys from Leicester and Nottingham and London and Glasgow, and that was great. But only more recently are we getting a better, more accurate and more widespread view of some of that fighting in the Pacific.
Yeah, it's exactly very similar stories. It's a story of colonization and colonialism in many ways. But at least now we're thinking about the story.
Yeah.
So the one person we want to talk about, one of those great characters, is Brigadier Arnold Potts. Potts is he's on my left, looking at it. He's got the little swagger stick. Potts commanded the 21st Brigade, and Potts was he's taking over the force. It's fighting there at Isarava. He was interesting in that he was a very distinguished soldier during the First World War. But as with most of the Australians, they're citizen soldiers. So he's not a professional full-time soldier. He soldiered during the First World War, went back to the land. He's from Western Australia during the interwar period. And then when the Second World War comes around, he kind of joins up again. Potts ends up being sacked from the Australian commanders. And so this is why when we're thinking about what happened in Kokoda, we've got a series of defeats. Brigadier Potts is receiving his headquarters saying, "Oh, why are you falling back? I don't understand what's going on. You should, in theory, be outnumbering the Japanese. Why are you still reversing? Why don't you just dig in?" So Potts had it was a very challenging battle space for him to operate in. There was an incredible lack of maps, which we get to. And so Potts is trying to he actually went over the Kokoda Trail. His orders were to get to Kokoda and then recapture Buna, like just to advance. He had very little maps with him, and what he's trying to do is really to bring up his supply lines, bring up his stores, develop those logistics, So that's why you have Myola Lake. So we have the start of airborne resupply drops. This is developing during this campaign, where you have a C-47 flying low over the dry lakes of Myola, slowing down maybe a little bit, and just guys chucking stuff out the side, food rations and munitions and the like, developing those stores. But Potts was under a lot of pressure. And to the point we were talking about the fighting at, say, Brigade Hill, that's his brigade headquarters. You know, he's there fighting with the men himself. But he's in a very difficult situation, and he ends up being dismissed during September. So one of those guys who really, in hindsight, did a fantastic job on the battlefield, never really got the rewards that he probably deserved, and was a victim of political pressure. And he was one of
that's
three.
so typical then, isn't it? It's that the ones who were there first are building the reconnaissance, they're building the data, they're learning how not to do things, how to do things, that the ones that follow then take in some ways the credit for. And you could give 100 examples of various campaigns in World War II where you could identify the fool guy who gets replaced by the guy who takes the credit, and you go, hang on, the fool guy actually contributed to the successor's ability to do what he did. But that's the nature of war. Sometimes there has to be a change made, and someone has to be sacrificed, in a sense, for the greater good of pushing an army forward. So it's important to go back and acknowledge some of these figures that are ousted and look at their contributions.
Yeah, and Brigadier Potts, particularly from Western Australia, is one of those great heroes. Because when Potts went over, he had, as I mentioned, he had a very brief sketch map of Boona, and he also had like a silhouette outline of the ridge line of the Owen Stanley Range, and there it was measured out by time, so how many days to trek or hours between different trekking points, rather than a sort of technical map. Now, I'm not really sure if these ones will turn up really well on the screen, but your K11 map here, and then there's also another map of the Kagagi area. These are the type of contemporary battlefield maps that the Australian commanders were operating with. So if you've ever done, compare these maps. This is 42. Look at a map from, say, Tobruk in 1941, or a map of Normandy in 1944, or a First World War trench map. First World War trench map, you can get down to, within feet or meters as to the situation of the terrain. This is essentially what the Australian commanders on the ground were operating with. And these came in during late August into early September. As you can see, they're not very detailed, but this is all the sketchy information the Australian battlefield commanders had on the ground, but also their political masters or their superior officers, whether they be General Rowell in Port Moresby, or General Sir Thomas Blamey, or General Douglas MacArthur. So there is this information gap. So it makes it very, really hard. That's why there's such a massive difference between that lived experience, the fighting experience between, say, Brigadier Potts and General MacArthur's expectation, because this is
a joke, isn't it? I feel I shouldn't be doing a joke, but it's where a general, I don't know which campaign it's on, but the general hands a map to the junior officers. There's the map you'll need for this campaign. And the junior officers, but it's blank, sir. Yes, just fill it in when you get there. It's that kind of joke, isn't it?
Very much, very much. So here's just a better one of Uriabira map, ridge line. So again, it's a very small, narrow front, and I just sort of included these as part of the captured intelligence of the what we're operating with. And so this is sort of from October 1942. So those first few months, you got fighting Sarava, Brigade Hill, late August into early, and then by mid-September, the Japanese had made their way across most of the Owen Stanley Range, and they actually dig in at Uriabira Ridge. So this was that would be as far south as the Japanese would come. They form this up as their defensive line. They dig in, and then meanwhile you have a changeover of Australian forces, because it's taken quite a while before the Australians, or before General Douglas MacArthur really decide to reinforce the Australians along the Kokoda Trail. And so the 21st Brigade is relieved, and then they're replaced by the 25th, and then later on the 16th Brigades. So you have a bit of a changeover, and Uriabira was really that limit, that final limit from the Japanese advance.
And just to give us an idea of numbers, because the question just came in about how many Japanese had landed on the north coast and how many have got down to this ridge, approximately.
That's an excellent question, and I can't remember. There's several thousand. So the South Seas Force is based around the 144th Infantry Regiment. They've also have a battalion from a mountain brigade. some engineering elements, and they also, by this time, have received the 41st Infantry Division, the 41st Infantry Regiment. So we're talking about several thousand Japanese forces. Likewise, the Australians are kind of similar numbers. So in theory, a brigade, an Australian Infantry Brigade, is similar to a Japanese Infantry Regiment-ish. But the Japanese, too, have had a massive decrease in numbers. So even though they arrive in strength during that August and September period, think about them as waves breaking. So they hit the mountains and then they just kind of get weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. Mm. One of the and so by the time the Japanese get to Uribarri is they're in a pretty incredibly dire state. You know, the Japanese soldiers are living on a handful of rice. They're carrying their wounded forward with them. Part of the reason General Horry's orders were to capture the high ground. So while I'm just giving you some examples of what the Australians had to operate with, the Japanese had virtually no intelligence, no information at all. The way they kept going was basically to follow the trail, and if they still having contact with the Australian troops, that they knew that's where the enemy was. So they're advancing to contact. They're following what would become the main track, and they're capturing those Australian stores that have been built up by, say, Brigadier Arnold Potts. So they're using Australian food to continue going. By the time they get to Uribarri, though, they're living on a handful of rice. They're incredibly sick. The Japanese are dying now in larger numbers. And it's said that at night the Japanese could see the lights from Port Moresby. So they wanted to get across the Owen Stanley Range, because once they thought that once they got across the mountains, then they'd be into these open plains and capture Port Moresby. The kicker is, though, that by the time they get to Uribarri, at this point, General Horry, the Japanese commander, has received orders to pull back his force back across the mountains. Because by this time, the Japanese commanders in Rabaul had realised, no, Guadalcanal is more important, Guadalcanal is more significant. So this is all happening around about the time of Alligator Creek, and those key fightings on Guadalcanal. And so General Horry is then told, and he retreats, and he doesn't use the word retreat, they advance to the rear. And it's said there's a Japanese war correspondent who went with the Southeast Force that when they received these orders to fall back, the men themselves were crying their tears in their eyes. So it was a pretty powerful and breaking moment for the Japanese perspective. And then from the Australian perspective at Uribarri, have a slight changeover, and then from late September into early October, this is the time when we go on the advance. And we're fighting in places such as Templeton Crossing, and then later on up here up to Yora Creek. So this is the pivot too on that Australian story of Kokoda. Now we're advancing, but in reality, we're just pursuing the Japanese, because at Templeton's Crossing and at Yora Creek here, and this is the battle sketch map, the small elements of the Japanese dig in and fight very successful blocking actions, and the main Japanese force will retreat back to eventually Buna and the beachheads.
Yeah, and what in these kind of engagements, you're not gonna, neither side is going to be able to employ many. I'm going to kind of say, training, outflanking maneuvers and Sandhurst type. It's all about almost brute force, isn't it? Stubbornness, not giving ground, and just persistence of laying down fire. There's not been many opportunities for anybody to kind of invent some incredible maneuver, because the environment doesn't allow that to happen.
No, not in this initial part. So the Japanese, again, it kind of changes. And so during this period of Australian withdrawal, it is pretty much an infantry action. The Allied air forces are bringing supplies, and yes, they're raiding and harassing the Japanese lines of communication, attacking Wairopi in the beachhead area. But there's no close tactical support. Brigadier Potts is not calling in an airstrike or anything like that. Likewise, all this fighting takes place outside of the range of Allied artillery pieces. So it's really just an infantryman with his rifle, with his Lewis gun, later on a Bren gun, with his Thompson submachine gun. That's pretty much it. So it's an infantryman's fight. The Japanese, while they have a lot of disadvantages, such as poor communication lines, that's the other thing too. Communications is terrible. The wireless sets that we used didn't work in that type of environment. You had to use a lot of runners, just guys with telephone and wire. Very, very basic communication. So if you're trying to command that battle space, incredibly difficult from the Australian perspective. The Japanese situation is even worse. The only advantage the Japanese really had, though, was they had their what they called knee mortars, so small infantry mortars, as well as several, I think 2 or 3 small mountain guns, so small howitzers. So the Japanese did have more firepower, but it's still very much an infantryman's war, whether it be the Australians or the Japanese sort of trying to outmaneuver, but it's really patrolling, raiding, harassing, just wearing down the enemy. And it's who can be fed in many ways too. And so here the photograph we have is General Horry. He's the commander of the South Seas Force. Both the 144th as well as the 41st Infantry Regiment, as well as General Horry, her experienced soldiers. They had both of these units who served in China early on in the piece. So a large conscript, largely conscript force. Horry, though, was a professional soldier. It's interesting with Horry that when he was first given the brief to take the South Seas Force and take them across the Owen Stanley Range, Horry thought it couldn't really be done. But why he questioned the orders, he never challenged them. So he himself realised the limitations of what he's being asked to do. Yeah, but the Japanese perspective is quite interesting.
Yeah, and again, probably underappreciated and underwritten about compared to the Australian point of view. But yeah, it's this is fascinating stuff. By the way, everyone's enjoying it. I think. Well, I think they are. They're definitely enjoying it.
Well, so from October, yeah, the momentum's really changed. Just very much on the Australian perspective. Thought to be the control seat. We're going back across the mountains. And here we have a lovely tea party. So the bloke on the left, Tubby Allen, with his cigarette hanging out of his mouth. You then have General Douglas MacArthur with having a brew, just going, oh, no, where are you going? And then General Sir Thomas Blamey on the right. So this really it looks quite pleasant. This is the base of the Owen Stanley Range. The 16th Brigade is about to go over the mountains. And General MacArthur, while he actually talks to the brigade commander, saying, Lloyd, by some act of God has placed you here. There's the Japanese, go and don't stop till you kill them all. Always to that effect. Great photograph. However, really misleading. So Blamey and MacArthur, while this is all going on, there's still a lot of political pressure. MacArthur doesn't understand why we've been in the back foot. So we've already sacked Brigadier Arnold Potts. Blamey is there. He also sacks General Rowell. And then later on, just after this photograph is taken, Major General Tubby Allen was also dismissed. So they're the 3 Australian generals who were sacked, partly through political pressure, as much as anything else. But yeah, it's a great photo. But there you do see the stores in the background too. That's the other thing I should have mentioned. So here's the 16th Brigade. So yeah, the stores. This is a big jeep hub, vehicle hub. Logistics is key. We always know this in any battle, any campaign. It's not just about the soldiers and the riflemen. It's about the food, maintaining those supply lines being set up. So Owens Corner is a massive supply hub. So here you have the 16th Brigade, again, just moving forward into October. They were relatively fresh. Again, they'd fought in the Middle East, had done a lot of fighting, experienced soldiers, but just to give you a sense of the terrain itself, what does it actually look like when you're marching across up the Owen Stanley Range. But this is also the battlefront too, the battle space. And so a lot of soldiers, and remember, these are young, fit soldiers. These are young men. They found that the climbing difficult, even though they went up 3 battalions in the line. They very quickly, columns became mixed, intertangled. Some men could climb quite well. Others coming down was really worse. So your group cohesion got mixed up. It's very hard to do. The soldiers walking up these tracks, because they're just living off the water, partly have supplies with them, but they're also drinking from creeks and crossings and so forth. So very quickly, within a few days, many of the men are already starting to become sick, and even with soldiers from the 16th Brigade, so these were fresh units going into the line, by this time they're already talking about having dysentery and diarrhea. So there's very unpleasant, but some fantastic accounts of soldiers actually with their bayonet, so have their shorts there, but with their bayonet, cutting a seam along the seam of their shorts and just going into the bush to do what they got to do, because they're already starting to suffer from dysentery and diarrhea and the like. Likewise too, when the men are there, they're already starting to shed stuff. So, their toothbrushes, they got snapped in half to lighten the load. Food you could eat the food, you keep the ammunition, but everything else. So your blankets were cut in half. People start to share their mess tins. So it's like, okay, I got my one, I'll have it, I'll share it with you. Paul, we don't need to take.
And it's interesting. You're reminding me of what Tony Redding said on our Chindits show, whenever the hell that was, a few months ago, about all these exact same lessons being learnt by the Chindit column in Burma. You know, cut a slit in the back of your trousers, one messed in. And yet they'd already been learnt 2 years. And you do, when you study military history, like someone like yourself, as you do realize the same lessons are being learned repeatedly because information is not being shared and assimilated. And, you know, armies to armies, and often the people there have to learn the same lesson that's already been learned somewhere else. But I also want to just ask you quickly about, by this point in the battle, that it's swinging in more of the Allies' favor. So, for in all your research into the accounts of people who were there, the conditions are still the same. You're still the track is still horrible. The disease is still there, but you must have noticed a sense of difference in the attitude of people when the initial stage is when you're holding and falling back, and the Japanese are advancing. You're on the back foot, and now the Japanese are falling back, and the Allies are advancing. That must have had some impact on the morale overall of the force.
It did, from the senior commander's point of view. So certainly MacArthur and Blamey are feeling more comfortable with the situation. The new commander, Major General Vasey, George Vasey, so Vasey replaced Allen. Vasey's feeling good because, yes, they are going forwards. The challenge was that they weren't moving fast enough. So there's still this pressure to keep, move your troops moving forward, don't slow down. And so, and actually Brigadier Lloyd, John Lloyd, who commands the 16th Brigade, after this campaign, he actually goes to India. So they do have some of that lessons learnt, swapping things around, but they still have some very vicious fighting. And so after Templeton's Crossing and Yori Creek, the Australians have moved back. The Japanese have done their job successfully in slowing down and blocking the Australian advance. The main body of the South Seas Force evacuates out of Kokoda, gets towards the Kamusi River. And then on the 2nd of November 1942, the Australian forces now lead into Kokoda, and then on the 3rd, so the day after, they recapture Kokoda Station. Well, they've already captured Kokoda Station, have a flag raising ceremony. But then the fighting is still going to continue for about 2 more weeks. So you've got the next side at Gowari, which is one of those last actions sort of in the Kokoda campaign. And this is quite interesting because by this time, there has been that shift within the Australian forces. They're down out of the mountains, still very out of the mountains, but it's a big, here they start to operate with confidence in jungle warfare. And so Gowari is one of those key actions because it shows the confidence of what the Australians have been able to develop. Previously, so in the early July, August period, so this is when we're operating without comfort or confidence in the jungle. By this part of the campaign, so November, so about 3 or 4 months later, they picked it up, realised that the jungle is neutral, if I steal that phrase. They have the ability to move, and it becomes much more of a manoeuvre warfare type stuff. And they can basically outflank the Japanese who are now dugging in. So it's in reverse. Now we're the ones manoeuvring, the Japanese are dug in. And then from about mid-November, the Australians cross the Kamusi River, and that's kind of the wrap-up of the Kokoda campaign. And then from that later part of November into December 42, this is when we move into the mopping up beachhead battles. And so from the Australian perspective, we really consider them to be 2 separate entities. So you've got the Kokoda campaign, and then you've got the beachhead battles. And this is an interesting here. So we've got Kokoda battlefield marker in 1945, and then Nisarava. And so this goes back to our first part of the conversation about how these things remembered. So back in the day, Kokoda was just one of many campaigns. This was the battlefield marker. It was a battlefield marker at Kokoda Station itself. It was a memorial cairn. It was one of several that were across Papua as well as New Guinea. But in many ways, it wasn't something extra special. But by 2002, Kokoda has become these values of courage, endurance, sacrifice, and mateship. So those are the 4 values or 4 attributes inscribed on each stone at the Isarava Memorial. And so during that course of the 60 years, Kokoda has changed from just being one of many battles fought by Australian forces in the Pacific to almost the battle. And that's very much because of that strong sense of Australianness that I mentioned earlier before.
It's become a spirit. I mean, someone said that right at the beginning. I think it might have been Jeff Klepsig said it. It's become like the Dunkirk spirit. There's now a Kokoda spirit or a Kokoda essence that has been developed by the public themselves.
Yeah, totally. And it's that very strong sense of Australianness. So this is a campaign fought on Australian territory, under Australian command. Yes, MacArthur's there, but tactically not operationally. It's all about an Australian battlefield. You have the soldiers themselves enduring these horrific conditions, the casualties, the cost, the mud, the dysentery. Why? Because they want to stop the Japanese here at Isarabo or Kokoda or Inamata Ridge, because if they don't stop them here, then you're not going to stop them back home. So it's that very strong sense of Australianness that really has lent to Kokoda resonating, and it's those values of courage, mateship, endurance, sacrifice. That's what the diggers had at Gallipoli. That's their connection. And so in many ways.
Yeah, sorry, and it's that we've talked about it before with the Burma campaign, the Far East. It's only far away if you're from Britain. From you, this is almost a home. It's the home advantage, isn't it? I mean, it is just off your own board. It's part of Australia. So, from the American or British perspective, Papua New Guinea is a long way away. But from you, it's actually part of you. You're fighting on home soil, so it has a completely different resonance, a different way of being perceived. Which is, as we headed off the show, it is all about perceptions. And Americans watching this wouldn't think of this battle necessarily before going into this show as a home battle, but it really is.
This is our fight, and that's why it's so important. That's why it's endured. It's why people fight so hard. Is the Kokoda Track? Is the Kokoda Trail? Because this is ours, and so that's why it's powerful. And because we can go there today, we make it accessible. Kids go, or school groups go up, sporting groups do the Kokoda Trail. It's a way to bond. You build that spirit. That's why I was supposed to go there in 2020 and 2021. You take a group up, have that challenging time, and you come through it. It's still physically hard. You walk along much of the same. The track itself, it's changed over time. It changed during the war, but you still follow the same vibe. You get the same sense. It's the same steps. It's the same humidity. It's the same heat. And usually, too, when you go up there, you have to, from Port Moresby, you leave up to Bamana War Cemetery. So that's that sort of linchpin too. So Bamana War Cemetery, it is the largest Commonwealth War Cemetery for Australians. 4,000 Allied personnel who were buried there. And that's, again, that keeps it real too. So if you're doing the Kokoda Trail, you have to visit Bamana.
I think that you made a important point there about the fact that Australians go there to actually do the track, to do the trail, because we know in learning that participating in something helps you remember it far better than someone telling you something or attending a lecture or reading a book. And that, it has to be said, if you're visiting Normandy, there's not much challenge involved in visiting the Normandy beaches. Everything's kind of laid out for you. You're not going to get hot and sweaty, But going to this part of the world, it is a physical ordeal. So I suppose if you're a young Australian or even a middle-aged Australian going there, and you've achieved walking some or all of that track, you have identified more closely with those original combatants there than perhaps just reading a book. You've got a sense of not having participated in the same thing. You're not going to compare your walking it with tour guides and taking photos to actually fighting there, but it does bring that event closer and make it more real than just reading about it. So I think that's integral to why it's perceived differently now and how it will be perceived differently as the decades go on, because there is still this sense of going there and achieving something. It's not something you can just tick off without putting physical effort in.
It's about 7 to 10 days to do it today. It's like you want to do them like COVID aside, but sign up for a modern trek, you're looking about a week to do it. So that's a commitment. This isn't, you can't just blow in and do it in 2 hours and then come back again. You have to commit to doing it. You've got to do all the training for it, the preparation, the physicality of it. And I think that's why people get it, because also there's no mobile reception. So you can't tweet while you're up there really. So it's just you, the people you're walking with, the environment, and that forced time out. And so that's why I think it's very powerful. And so many people have the sense of spirituality, because you are totally immersed in the experience.
But we've only just done the first part of the show. I mean, we're going on a bit, but I don't mind. I'm completely enjoying it. It's taking my mind off being worried about the football later. But we are going to go on and talk about Milne Bay as well, because Kokoda and the events there are one part of the story, and it was very important that you wanted to tackle this other part as well. So moving right ahead.
Yeah, so meanwhile, basically it really is a meanwhile. So while this was taking place along the Kokoda Trail, particularly in August and September. So this is the time of Bruce Kingsbury, it's the time of Visarava. It's when the 21st Brigade and Arnold Potts are falling back. The Japanese are also looking around to support their overland advance on the mountains. And Milne Bay itself, if you recall the map of Papua, it's on the eastern tip. Early in 1942, General MacArthur realised how strategically important it was. And so he wanted to develop a series of airfields at Milne Bay. Developing those airfields there did a few things. One, it protected, after the Coral Sea, realised that the eastern approach from the sea was vulnerable. So if you develop an air base at Milne Bay, that air fleet can help defend the approach from Port Moresby. Also, too, if the Allies had Milne Bay, then they'll be able to then hop around to get to Boona. And from Milne Bay too, Allied bombers could fly and attack Rabaul without having to fly over the Owen Stanley Range. So there's this massive part of the air wall that's also going on, which you haven't really spoken about. But that's why Milne Bay is strategically important from the Allied perspective. Now, from the Japanese point of view, they have got their forces fighting along the Solomon Islands, so they're fighting in Guadalcanal. They've got Hori and the South Seas Force across the Owen Stanley Range. And the Japanese feel that if they can capture the airfields at Port Moresby, then that will help support their overland advance. Because then, likewise, they'll also be able to defend their air base at Rabaul even more. So that's why Milne Bay is quite key. The Japanese thought there were 2 airfields there, but in reality it was 3. So where I've got the red dot on that map, that's where the Japanese were there were 3 airfields that had been developed, strip number 1, 2, and 3. But in essence, the first dot right in the middle of Milne Bay is where the Japanese were supposed to land. The other dots on the right where the Japanese did land. So they landed about 11 kilometres too far east of where they should have been. So this is on the 25th of August, the Japanese land in force. Milne Bay itself is a bay. You've got the sea on one side, you have very intense mountains on the other side. It was not the best environment, like it was wet all the time. Soldiers complained about dysentery, diarrhea. It was constantly raining. It was from an Australian and Allied perspective, it was underdeveloped. You don't want to be, but there were some plantations there. You don't want to be rude about the Papuans. That's their home and their land. But certainly, Australian soldiers and airmen really struggled to operate in that space, in that environment. It's just hot and humid and just really unpleasant.
And then saying we should do our entire show on Milne Bay at one point. Well, yes, we'll get there eventually. It's all about whetting people's appetite and trying to cover these things. As I'm finding with the Pacific Campaign, you have to understand it. You have to keep lots of plates spinning because you've got to keep Guadalcanal in your head there. You've got to keep the Port Moresby there, and to try and understand all the context at the same time. You've got to understand the Allied point of view, the Japanese point of view. There's a lot of things you've got to consider, or you end up, just as we've talked about, taking them all in isolation, which is interesting, but far more interesting to keep them all and understand, or try and understand, keep top on all of these things happening concurrently, because that's where you really start to get this understanding of this campaign, I think.
Yeah, and you also, any campaign, and you say the Pacific War, you have to do it with maps. Like, you're constantly going backwards and forwards just to see who's talking about what. But here you got this is now the challenge, and really illustrates it really quite well. From the Australian perspective, you've got General Clowes, who we'll meet in a minute, with Milne Force. It is... The challenge with Milne Bay is because of that physicality, because of the environment. There were roads, but they were muddy. In the range, you couldn't move forces around very well. You had a smaller number of vehicles. There were no real armoured vehicles to speak of. Yes, there's universal carriers, but that's about it. There was some small boats, but they were destroyed. And from the Australian perspective, if the Japanese land at one part of the bay, what's to stop them from making a subsequent landing on another point of the water at any other time over the next couple of days, or rounding, so they land on the northern part of Milne Bay. That other night they could have landed on the southern side, more to the west. So it's a really interesting battle space. And General Clowes, who's the Australian commander there, talks about the fog of war, and he said at Milne Bay, the fog of war was never thicker. It was just a really hard place for him to get his head around, particularly because the Japanese could come in. So usually by Navy at night, and the Japanese are able to move whenever they wanted to. So that's why in many ways they've got the initiative, and the Australian commanders are always in the back foot during the first part of the fighting at Milne Bay.
Good.
Yeah, so here's Cyril Clowes here, great pipe smoker. I call him Silent Cyril. He got along really quite well with his superior, General Rao, who's in Port Moresby. The two of them had known each other for a very long time. They served together in the First World War, maintained that connection during the interwar period. Rao really trusted Clowes. So when this is all taking place, because when the Japanese landed on the 25th of August, Clowes has got, on paper, again, it looks like quite a strong force. You've got the militias, so these are your Chocos from the 7th Brigade. You have the 18th Brigade also come into the action. You have 2 fighter squadrons with Kitty Hawks, so 75 and 76 squadrons. And you've got Hudson's with number 6 squadron as well. So there should be a really strong allied force. And this is why MacArthur's like, well, hang on. When the Japanese have landed, why aren't you just like consolidating forces and pushing them back into the ocean? And Clowes, though, was like, well, I don't know what the Japanese are going to do tomorrow night. They can come into the bay any given time. They really control the sea at this point in time. And so it took him several days to figure out why, if this was the main attack or if the Japanese were going to reinforce them, which is exactly what they did. But they just reinforced their supply lines rather than outflank the Australians and come in from the airfields from another position. So Clowes got along really quite well with Rao, but Rao was under political pressure from really MacArthur as well as Blamey. And Rao ends up getting sacked during the course of this fight. So this is just an aerial view of where the Japanese did land around Wagga Wagga and Wandala, which was about 11 kilometres east of where they should have landed at Rabi. And this is really when you start to see very early on the rhythm of the campaign. So while the Japanese are able to reinforce their supplies and forces at night by sea, and generally the Japanese troops moved at night, the Australians tended to move by day, and this is when they could bring in their great assets, such as the Kitty Hawk squadrons. The first thing they start to do is really start to shoot up and destroy the Japanese beachhead area. So attacking those barges, sinking the barges, and that meant that the Japanese who had landed really had to move on foot, and it also meant they weren't in a position to build up their supply bases. And this operation is taking place by the special Japanese Marines. Naval Marines. And that's just a look of what the area looks like sort of today in 2017. It's the bay itself, but it's still incredibly similar, but where you have the jungle right on down to the water. That's the then, and this is a nowish. Really still quite dense jungle, right up to the water. There are community and landowners sort of into the bush, and after the campaign, the Allies, particularly Americans, made this part a massive naval base. So a lot of the war relics and debris that are there today relate to after the battle, but it's still an incredible place to visit. And again, this is just looking through where the Japanese landed to their invasion beaches. So imagine there's no van there, like back in 1942. Japanese come in and just moving into that jungle, that type of terrain. And then off screen, you can't see it, you just have this phenomenal mountain range. So there's not a lot of action, and much of the fighting really followed the old government road, which ran parallel to the road. So in many ways, it's the Air Force that were really decisive, the decisive factor. And so you have the Kitty Hawks taking off from the airstrips. They're taking off, being bombed up, loaded up, taking off, and then going strafing the Japanese. Because by the 27th of August and to the 28th, 29th, Japanese move up to the Allied landing strips, but they're just, very intense fighting. If anything moved during the day, basically the Kitty Hawks are going to try and blast off the ground, machine gun it, shoot it up. It's talking accounts too of, Japanese snipers falling out of the trees as they're being brassed up. The pilots say there's the pilot Nat Gould. He flew a Kitty Hawk. He served in the Middle East, comes back, serves in the Pacific, flies to Milne Bay, and he just talked about just the difficulties, because by this time too, these pilots were also suffering from malaria and got dysentery. And so they're sitting there in the sea of the Kitty Hawk, just drops, they're still operating, still having flight actions. But it's incredibly. These guys are just amazing. Like, I really do think.
Absolutely, yeah. And these photos are just incredible of the terrain again, isn't it? You know, and it's all about understanding the terrain of a battle, and that's where, again, what we're able to do these days, because books, still there's a limited amount of photos you can put in books because of publishing costs, and this is where the YouTube age, the internet age, is really opening up these battlefields, because people can go there, make travel photos, put them online. And I think this is the golden age for understanding battlefields now, because they've never been more photographed and video.
Yeah, and it kind of illustrates too, or I'm hoping it illustrates the challenges of the terrain. So this is the main road, and at this time it had been raining constantly. A lot of the small rivers were flooded, so that limited how you can move your forces around. So if you're in Brisbane, if you're MacArthur, telling Rao to then tell Clowes to hurry up and move his force, Clowes is like, well, how? I can't just put them into a vehicle because the roads turn to mud. It's a sea of mud. You can't move troops up too quickly. So the 7th Brigade is replaced by the 18th in terms of that fighting that takes place. The 7th Brigade had that first initial engagement against the Japanese, and then they fall back. And again, they kind of fall back to each river crossing. Each river is the front, because it's very hard to ford these flooded rivers. It's difficult to do it today, in 2017, let alone back in 1942. So manoeuvring your ground forces is really difficult. But it is the challenge. Ultimately, though, by the night of the 30th, the 31st of August, the Japanese do get to that one airstrip. The fighting itself, the airstrip becomes a battlefield. The Japanese come out of the jungle. They're lit up. They're exposed as they cross the landing strip. The Australians, there's also a small number of American engineers who also take part in the fight, engage Japanese, and that's really when they break the back of that first initial Japanese advance. And then from the 1st of September onwards, it's really the Australians are again pursuing the Japanese as they're withdrawing. And that's just a photograph of what it kind of looks like today, or at least in 2017. The local landowner has maintained those grounds. That's the original battlefield marker at that spot where the Japanese Marines were killed and buried. We saw in the earlier slide. Spots still there. There's also markers to the Air Force too, and Turnbull, who was an Australian ace pilot. He was killed during the fight. He was strafing, clipped a tree and crashed and was killed. You pay a couple of kina to the landowner, and you can wander around the battle space. It's pretty cool.
And we've got a nice demo now coming up now. So this tell us where this is then.
Well, so this is just along the track. So this is a little bit after the battle. So the Japanese, what helped give the Japanese advantage is that while we had air support, the Japanese, as they're moving through night, particularly making that attacking through the rain, through the jungle, the Japanese tanks, the 2 Hago tanks, supporting the Japanese attack. From the Australian perspective, that it's night, it's raining, you have these 2 big behemoths, the noise, the lights, and the Japanese would actually use their headlights on the tanks to light up the Australian positions. So it would have been incredibly terrifying, because our guys don't have that type of armor support. They don't have very strong anti-tank weapons. They don't have their own armor. So if you hear a noise coming, you know it's going to be a Japanese tank, and that would have been terrifying, because all that fighting took place at night. The Japanese tanks eventually became bogged, and the second tank, the tank in the old photograph, is in now the furthest one. Yeah, that one there. That's in the War Memorials collection. So we have that in display in Canberra. Milne Bay is quite. I'll come back to what's important, but that's sort of trying to do that little bit of then and now type of analysis as to where I thought the spot was. In reality, though, I think I was a little bit too far to the left, whereas 1942 the road was very much just right on the waterfront, whereas today they've moved the roads a little bit inland, but it's still.
I'm thinking how easy it is anomaly, because we always have church towers and stone walls and religious statues, and it's easy to match up photos. If there's one bit there, you can find it, but matching up jungle a little bit trickier.
Yeah, the hard thing is rivers are pretty good. So river crossings can change. Watercourses don't tend to change too much. The coastlines change. There's what do you call it? Erodes.
Right.
Banks of rivers widen or sometimes shorten. So you can get a sense of the government road then as today, might be a little bit more inland. And so when we're trying to do that battlefield type of figuring out where things were, it was really, well, what's the watercourses? Because they're still kind of the same. The challenge, though, is that names changed. So when you think doing the same sort of thing along the Kokoda Trail, villages move. So this might be Naro, but it's not like in 2017, but it's not Naro in 42. The villages moved and it takes the name with it. And there's a couple of rivers in Milne Bay where they've changed the name of the river. So it's challenging, but also. And so right at the end of the action at Milne Bay, the Australians have been pushing back, particularly 18 Brigade and 2nd 9th Battalion, and this is the last of mopping up action because the Japanese are able to actually withdraw some of their forces from Milne Bay. They know it's a defeat, unsuccessful landing, and so they're evacuated by sea. And then, on the 4th of September, John French is leading an action forward, takes his patrol, takes out one, takes out second pit, and then he's killed, clearing the third pit. And he's also, he is awarded a Victoria Cross. His paperwork was signed off first, and so sometimes you'll see a reference to French being the first Australian awarded a Victoria Cross. So technically, in terms of the paperwork being signed off, but the date of this was the 4th of September, whereas Kingsbury's paperwork got in a little bit later because, they're fighting that withdrawal across the Owen Stanley Range.
Yeah.
That was submitted later, but his action was on the 29th of August. So Kingsbury's kind of gazumps French in some ways as to who gets the first Victoria Cross on Australian territory. I don't think it matters who was first, but it's quite important. And so now this is in Alatala. So that's where today, when you go to Port Moresby, if you take a cruise to Port Moresby, you land at Alatala, which was a post-war development. And this is kind of an industrial area. That's roughly where the spot of French's VC action took place. And that's really now the back end of the fighting at Milne Bay. And it's basically a case part in an industrial state. Because it's really built up, it's really hard to figure out where the Japanese were then evacuated from. And the landscape has changed. And we weren't really able to, when I went with a group of the soldiers, retired army officers, we couldn't figure out exactly where French's VC action was. We wanted to find it, but we just couldn't make it work. But the vibe's still there, and it's still pretty impressive.
You're close to it, yeah.
Yeah, and these are some of the contemporary battlefield markers, and in many ways, I think they've just moved them to a convenient space. It's almost like being in the centre of a roundabout. So it's like, here's the vibe. In terms of marking the 18th.
Well, that's another thing, is that over the years, you get that in Arnhem and Normandy, where the monuments shift to where the roads are. They shift to where the parking facilities can be, and it doesn't change things too much. But so you go, hang on, this isn't exactly where it used to be. They've just, but I can understand making it more convenient for travellers becomes a important aspect, and so. It's a compromise between accuracy and accessibility, and like in a museum and like the memorial you run, there's always that compromise between information. How much do you give people? How much do you not give them? Will you bore them? Everything is about imparting history. Is a compromise, isn't it?
Yeah. You have to interpret these things, and sites move, interprets, places move. Like the battle space may now be someone's home, or it's like a factory where people got to make a living, got to hustle. So you don't want to say, this should be where it is. I think it's more important we go there, we think about it, we explore it, we tell these stories, and that's, to me, that's what I think is really quite key. But Milne Bay is really important. So it's the first decisive defeat of a Japanese amphibious operation during the war. Very important because it's a clear-cut victory. While the things are taking place along the Kokoda Trail, the outcome's still not decided or not clear-cut, whereas Milne Bay is a clear win for the Allies, a clear win for the Australian forces, a clear win for the Allies. That's important. And it also became a really major intelligence coup as well. So in addition to capturing those 2 Japanese Hargo tanks, there's a whole bunch of kit, uniform, there's a flamethrower, there's bulletproof vests, documentation. It's an intelligence win for the Allies. And so that's why I think Milne Bay really needs to be considered when we're talking about Papua in 42. It's not just
and yet it hasn't got that essence that Kokoda Trail track has. That Milne Bay doesn't invoke the emotions to most people that Kokoda Trail, or indeed Gallipoli, because you sent me that paper you wrote where you compared Gallipoli and Kokoda, and it's as we started off this show, it's all about perceptions and how a spirit of a battle can be remembered beyond the details of the battle. We talk about, as we said, we talk about a Dunkirk spirit, or politicians refer to a D-Day coming up as being a large, complicated but pivotal thing coming up. And yet, of course, we all know that the D-Day we talk about as D-Day was one of many D-Days, and yet the other D-Days have been forgotten as being D-Days. So it's all about perception. It's all about these status that's beyond the study of the battle itself. But interesting that, because we're going to end the show in a minute, I had a message this morning from Brian Dimitrovich, who did the Alligator Creek Guadalcanal show with me last year. And he's saying that I should do a Guadalcanal week, and maybe I should, but I'm thinking maybe I should do a Solomon Islands, New Guinea, Papua kind of week or so. But I'm now, while you were talking, I was thinking, how would I break that down? I'm maybe thinking to break it down month by month rather than campaign by campaign, and maybe do a series of shows over 5 days where I kind of bring in Australian historians for a bit, then bring American ones in, then bring British ones, and maybe someone who studies the Japanese point, and kind of do it timeline wise, maybe, or maybe I should do it campaign wise. But I will mull that one over and take advice from people like yourself. But I think if we could do something where we keep these metaphorical plates I was talking about spinning, where we could try and make that sort of August to November or July to December period of 42 make it sense for people, that would be really good. So maybe not a Guadalcanal week, but whatever. I'll give it a label. I'll sleep on that. But that would you be prepared to come back and join in something like that? John McManus.
Yeah, if you have me back, absolutely. I mean, maybe you could do it like a group chat. Could be because it's so. What I was just talking about Issue and Issarava going on, Milne Bay at the same time. All the fighting at Milne Bay has just been wrapped up and resolved. So Alligator Creek has just happened like a couple of days beforehand. So that's why they're all so closely connected. And so meanwhile, so Karl in Australia, what is doing this, or what's happening in Guadalcanal, because it's all taking place concurrently. But that's the real challenge. And if you had it from a Japanese perspective, because they're about and like, oh yeah, we've got Milne Bay, we've got Kokoda, we've got Guadalcanal. The fighting's also taken place at Wau, so which is up in New Guinea. So which is like a third front, which is also taking place at this time. So there's just so much going on. That's also the challenge if you're writing a book or if you're trying to interpret that space in the gallery. These aren't the narrative isn't always easy to break down and distill. They're not linear.
And how much of the other campaigns do you put in? I mean, if you're doing a book about Milne Bay, you could put a footnote about Guadalcanal. You could do an entire 17 chapters about it, and exactly where does the balance of your book go? And the publishers are giving you a word count, and you're thinking how I want this book to be readable, and it's very complicated to know what to put in and what to put out. One of the things I love my World War II TV viewers, but often I get comments about what I didn't put in a show. You didn't cover that. I go, well, think about what we did cover. We talked about a subject for an hour and a half. There's only so much you can fit in. But I like the fact people are giving me that constructive feedback of, you didn't mention that, you didn't mention that. I go, yeah, sure, I didn't, because every single rabbit hole is a show in its own right. Every single one of these events. You could talk about Victoria Crosses awarded in the campaign. That could be a show. You could talk about Japanese armor involved in the Solomon Islands. That could be a show in its own right. That's the challenge, is knowing when to stop. But I think just to finish things up, because we did mention this Gallipoli Kokoda connection there, without going into your whole paper, what basic conclusion did you make about the connection between these two events?
Yeah, so Gallipoli was that first major action during the First World War. 25th of April 1915. Campaign went for 9 months until the end of 1915. But basically, my argument is that both Gallipoli and Kokoda resonate now because of those values, because of those attributes. In many ways, we've transcended the historical narrative. Doesn't matter if something happened on this day or that day. It was the 11th or the 12th. Was it this unit or was it that unit? I think what people have latched onto, what they understand, and why it still resonates, 80 or 100 years later, it's these values and attributes. It's the emotional connection. Yeah. The hardship, it's the environment, it's the physicality of the place. It's just getting the vibe as to what happens. And so that's why these things endure, or the stories that do endure, is because they can be broken down into something that's simple and emotive and evocative, and you can get there. Rather than some other places, say you're fighting in Ley or Finchafen or Slaters Knoll and Torquay, it's really about, can we get to this place? How does it make me feel? What's my connection from it? And then if you've got that first hook, then people can go off and read more, listen to more podcasts, do the other additional battlefield tours. Because I always feel like I've been doing this I've been at the Memorial for 15 years. I'm always learning, always looking at something new. And I always feel like I'm just like in an imposter, just scratching the surface. Now we've been talking.
Welcome to my world, Karl. That's how I feel all the time. Yeah, no, and I think the values you can take from something, the fact that the details of battle can't change, and that if it took place on the 12th, it always took place on the 12th. But the values and the lessons we can learn from it are ever evolving. Take the Battle of Britain. We're in the Battle of Britain commemorative period again, right now again. And of course, I think back when I was a kid, Battle of Britain was very much perceived as the fighter pilots, the few. And now I think we've shifted positively to looking at the Observer Corps and the Bomber Command or Coastal Command and the Home Front and the Navy and and it's broadened out. The Battle of Britain's spirit has broadened out to encompass a greater group of people than it always was. And so those values can be changing and evolving and getting better. And I would like to think that the next phases of studying the Solomon Islands and the New Guinea campaign, again, like we talked about, is bringing in the other peoples who are involved, the local involvement, the fact it was their fight as well, the people in Papua New Guinea, though it was their fight. So I think it's a constantly evolving understanding of these. But as I say, the bare dynamics of the battle won't change. If they had Lewis guns, they had Lewis guns. That's not going to change. But how we perceive it is going to be the challenge, and how we broaden out and make everybody feel a part of this history, I think, is important. And you have, with Gallipoli and Kokoda, you have these words that resonate, and that's important. And also has to say, as a Brit, you Australians do make brilliant war films. You don't make many of them, but your quality is incredible. What you've done over the years, going back to Gallipoli and Kokoda and the Vietnam one, what's the Vietnam SAS one? The Odd Angry Shot. I mean, you've done some classic movies that have entertained and also got people thinking about things. So that's another aspect that you're good at. That you're good at that aspect of taking an event and distilling it for the public as well, which perhaps is a lesson we Brits and Americans could learn from. But anyway, this has been fantastic, Karl. So did you enjoy it? You said you were nervous before going, or did you enjoy it though?
Well, it's my first time on YouTube, so yeah, I was a little bit nervous, but no, it's been. You've been a really great host. Thank you for having me. Thank you for letting me, take up an hour and a half of everyone's time. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, I'll come back and say goodbye in a minute. I'll just remind people what got coming up. So, football tonight. No show tomorrow because we did the show today because we did. And then Tuesday is the next show in Disasters and Tragedies week. And this one absolutely definitely goes into a tragedy because it's talking about the liberation of Manila in 1945 with James Scott and his incredible book, Rampage, which was one of those books that I read and I was horrified. I thought I knew about that event, and his book just reminded me brutally and honestly just how savage that was there. Then we've got Liditz later on, and we've got the massacre in Norway. So it does get a bit heavy, the content, in the next few days, but important to understand that there are lots of disasters and tragedies in World War II. So as usual, folks, the link to Karl's books about Kokoda is in the description below. Check out the Australian War Memorial. Check out us on Patreon. Check out Karl on Twitter and for more Australian content. And for Americans and Brits, consider reading more about the Aussies and indeed the New Zealanders in World War II and World War I, because although they are very knowledgeable about their story, we could learn more and pay more respect to what they did because it was an Allied contribution. So. But right now, it remains me to say thank you very much to Dr. Karl James for joining us. And I'm going to go and get stressed about the football and start worrying about it. So there you are. Thanks, everyone, for watching. And thank you for the incredible, there's been some really, really informative comments in the chat. So Cameron Evans, Dennis Burns, Alex Parkinson, Cameron, Dean Murphy, all been giving some really great value there. And I find myself after these shows, going back and reading all the sidebar because it is a mine of information. I'm incredibly impressed how knowledgeable you guys are out there, or whether you're just surfing and putting out facts. No, I think you genuinely know this stuff, and it makes me want to up my game, because I was talking to Soul David after Friday's show, before Friday's show. Conventional TV is aimed at the lowest common denominator. The assumption by program makers, I think, is that everybody out there are idiots. Give it to them, spoon feed these people ideas in very simple sound bites and dumb down programs. And I think actually what you guys are doing on World War II TV, and who you follow, History Hack and James and Alan, what have you, is you are very knowledgeable. You have got a thirst for detail, and it's making me reassured that doing these deep dives into history over an hour and a half is definitely worth doing, because I look at the hits these 5-minute histories gets on YouTube and I think they're getting 500,000 hits. I'm not getting 500,000 hits, but I'd much rather be doing what I'm doing, talking to you guys in detail, than doing these short, insignificant overview understandings of World War II. So that's my last comment today. But anyway, thank everybody for watching. Thank you, Karl. I will see you all again on Tuesday with James W. Scott. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV and Karl James saying enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much for watching.